A lot of reasons why people don't like America. The point is, the more you get involved, the more active you are, the more enemies you will make. I worked for Ronald Reagan. I really like him. But he made, in my view, one huge mistake internationally. He was putting U.S. forces into Lebanon. He put U.S. forces into Lebanon in 1983 in the middle of a civil war where there were 25 different armed factions. And the U.S. supported one of them. It was the nominally Christian faction that was nominally the government. It controlled the city of Beirut and virtually nothing else. You can go back to find newspaper accounts at the time. You can read about the USS New Jersey battleships sitting offshore bombarding Muslim villages. Now, it should surprise no one that American military personnel and embassy personnel became targets. We put our forces right in the middle of a war zone and took sides in a civil war. So the point is, nothing justifies attacks on civilians, but one has to understand why it happens and be cognizant of consequences. If you want to hit the hornet's nest, you cannot be surprised if you get stung. This is part of the cost then of an active foreign policy. The more active you are going to be, the more likely you are to get hit in return. And I think 9/11 is the very dramatic moment for us where, you've had to go back to really to 1945, really 1941, I suppose, where American homeland had been attacked with Pearl Harbor and takeover of some of the Aleutian Islands. The U.S. had seemed to be invulnerable, and what we found out a decade ago is the answer is no. That there are ways that people have to strike at us, and that has to go into our thinking when it comes to foreign policy. So all of those things need to be borne in mind. As we create a foreign policy, it is not cheap. It's going to cost you money, it's going to cost you lives, it's going to threaten your homeland. all of these things have to be taken into account as one thinks about a foreign policy. So the question is, what should our foreign policy be? Well, the Cold War ends in 1989. The first kind of full presidency, lengthy presidency, is that of Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton basically wanted a very expansive vision. Every alliance that we had, Cold War alliance, he wanted to expand or keep. NATO expansion started under Bill Clinton. The Soviet Union's gone, the Warsaw Pact is gone, but NATO, the anti-Soviet alliance, actually expands. All of America's alliance commitments in East Asia stayed the same. They put out a report by a man named Joseph Nye, it's called the Nye Report, and in it, it argued that every American commitment in East Asia was more important than ever. More important than at a time when the Soviet Union existed, more important than at a time when Maoist China and tens of millions of people were being murdered, the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and all this, more important than ever. Amazing. Even though there was no obvious enemy out there, all these commitments had to be preserved. He also, his foreign policy turned into what Michael Mandelbaum, who's at SAIS, Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, what Mandelbaum called a foreign policy as social work. Basically what you wanted to do is go do good things. And I would argue in many ways that was the attraction of the war in Kosovo. Is you go to war in Kosovo where America had not one conceivable national interest. Who should run Kosovo? I don't know. I've been there. I went there the summer before the war started, and what was very evident was the Albanians and the Serbs didn't like each other, and it was pretty clear they weren't going to live together. But there was no obvious, should we take sides and who gets what? We were mad because it was a brutal, nasty guerrilla war. About 2,000 people died in a couple of years before the war. Now, during that time frame, 250,000 people were being murdered in Liberia, which we didn't seem terribly concerned about. And our great ally, the Turks, who joined with us in the war against the Serbs, roughly 40,000 people that died in Kurdish resistance against Central Turkish authority. Now, who should win these conflicts? I don't know. Because they're very complex, they're based in history, they're rooted in a lot of hostility. Who should control these territories? I don't know. But what it would suggest to me is that maybe we shouldn't go to war to try to fix them. Because we don't know. It's a big problem. But I think from the standpoint of the Clinton administration, it really was social work. This is something good we can do, kind of reorder these places. That war suddenly became the new tool of social engineering. Now, about the same time, the Republican alternative was utterly incoherent. The only thing you could kind of understand about the Republican vision in the 1990s was they didn't like Bill Clinton. Now, perfectly fine with me if you don't like Bill Clinton and want to oppose him, but it's not much of a basis of a policy. So for the most part, Republicans wanted to spend more money on the military, wanted to expand traditional alliances, but they didn't like the social work stuff, especially like the Balkans. They kind of split all over that. But in 1994, they nominated as president Bob Dole, who was in favor of all that. and whose mantra during the campaign was, "We need leadership," whatever that meant. You know, they criticized Obama initiative, or Clinton initiatives, you know, like the agreement with North Korea, but didn't really offer an alternative. Now again, plenty of things, you know, this is basically we're trying to bribe the North Koreans, it hasn't worked out terribly well, but there aren't any obvious options, and nobody, you know, among the Republicans really offered a good alternative. It was simply they didn't like it. When we moved to George W. Bush, now Bush started out running and talked about humility in foreign policy, criticized nation building in the Balkans. He got Al Gore all upset because Condi Rice was talking about when they were running, maybe we don't have to have U.S. troops there. I mean, surprise, surprise. Maybe the Europeans could do this. Oh my goodness. You know, but of course, Bush comes into office, and then 9/11, and suddenly we have, in many ways, the most activist, the most interventionist, the most confrontational policy imaginable. Now what you see is a real turn where suddenly we're going to do it all. I mean, we're going to have a policy of maintaining all the big alliances, continued NATO expansion. We're going to continue, you know, maintain everything we're doing in East Asia. We're going to go essentially have a preventive war against Iraq. We're going to go into Afghanistan, I think for good reason, and, you know, take out the Taliban for hosting Al-Qaeda. You know, we're going to be threatening Iran. We're also, I mean, suddenly this became a very full foreign policy agenda. You know, so he came into office talking about, you know, much more humble, humility, you know, limited approach, and suddenly, you know, this becomes very active, very assertive, you know, very confrontational. Indeed, what you found with him in many ways was, you know, nation building became one of the most important aspects, and if you listen to the rhetoric, you know, basically George W. Bush became more Wilsonian than Woodrow Wilson. And an extraordinary flip, talking about democracy, liberation, bringing democracy building. I mean, complete transformation. Very active foreign policy. And I would argue the result then was kind of, you know, we essentially kept everything from the Cold War and added a bunch more stuff on. So, very, very big policy. So now we've got a new era. You know, the new era is that of, you know, Barack Obama. And I would argue that what we found out is he's not very different. Now my analysis is that, you know, Obama gave a speech that I think was very prescient, very smart and correct against the Iraq War. And what happened from that was essentially everybody on the left who was kind of less interventionist thought he's one of us. But Obama was very careful in the campaign and said very little to suggest that. Indicated moderation and centrist approach on Afghanistan and Iraq, said nothing to suggest rapid withdrawal, said nothing to suggest, you know, change anywhere else. He becomes president, and lo and behold, American policy looked an awful lot like that under George W. Bush. We had continued slow withdrawal from Iraq, but we may have 50,000 troops there for who knows how long. You know, for training, for this, for that. We don't know. There's no real promise that certainly they're going to be out anytime soon. The Afghanistan war is expanding. All of the major alliances remain. Now, you know, there's a somewhat left change in tone that's important, I think. You know, I think the Obama approach towards Russia and China, for example, is less confrontational. I think that's a positive thing. Nevertheless, if you kind of step back and, you know, forget the tone, in terms of substance, military spending today is higher than it was when George W. Bush was in office. There are no international bases that have closed. No American troops have come home. No war has been stopped. What we see then, I would argue, is in many ways the great interventionist consensus, which is that among kind of hawkish liberals, which I think is where Obama more or less is, which is pretty much where I think Clinton was, and hawkish kind of conservatives and Republicans, there's a difference in rhetoric, some differences in emphases. But broadly speaking, this remains kind of a consensus hyper-interventionist foreign policy. One that remains very expensive, and I would argue, at some point, very dangerous. And the question is, why continue this kind of a foreign policy? Why continue a policy that has the U.S. as the guarantor of wealthy, prosperous, populous countries around the world? Why have the U.S. continue as a nation builder? Why have the U.S. continue, you know, these kinds of policies? And, you know, one argument is, well, it's kind of the traditional security concerns. Is that while the Soviet Union might be gone, there are new threats to come along. But it's hard to see what they are. Russia is not much of a substitute. I mean, Russia is basically a declining power. It has nuclear weapons, so we have to treat it seriously. But it has very little capacity to intervene outside its borders. It can beat up on Georgia, but the notion that the Russian army is suddenly going to invade Western Europe and Congo, it's just, that's not going to happen.